Italian philosopher Vico di Gavantista understood the mind as made up of the fundamental places and images that make up the sensory impressions on our bodies. Mike Davis, in his book Magical Urbanism, gives us some insight into understanding Spanish-speaking neighborhoods. He tells us the basic building blocks of Spanish-speaking urban neighborhoods is not only individuals and households, but entire transnationalized communities. People are constantly divided by two places at once. The author Salvo Licata wrote, "The anxiety to reproduce the new place, all the conditions from the quarter from whence they came, becomes a piercing necessity. They seek, therefore, to reproduce the smells, the sounds, the fumes, the tastes." What can be understood from these descriptions is that cultural meaning is shared in spaces and places that create and display social and cultural rituals and symbols that have meaning to people, embodied meaning, and these enactments help to ensure that communities retain a distinctive sense of place. We learn from these events that the familiarity of visual, tactile, and sense impressions, such as taste, smells, sounds, can all be said to hold a unifying function in culture. Today, in our dialogue, Plaza Talk, Race and Place, we will learn about the importance of understanding space as a vessel of emotions, the container of our experiences, and the physical places that people can relate to. Our hope is to inspire you with a vision for the future that is based on Latino people's memory, needs, and aspirations. My name is Madeline Spencer, and I am a social psychologist from the depth psychological tradition, a scholar, activist, and place manager in the city of Santa Ana, California. Santa Ana is a capital city in the center of Orange County, which is unique due to a demographic inversion that began around the 1970s, where an influx of migration from Mexico made Santa Ana a Latino city. The city today that is the largest and densest city of expatriated immigrants outside of Mexico in the world. The city population is 80% Latino, and our school is 96%. I'm excited to moderate this dialogue today, in which we have an excellent expert panel of speakers who are working in cities across the United States, from California, Colorado, Texas, New York, and Seattle. Our speakers come from fields of urban planning, mobility justice, environmental justice, zoning, community engagement, art, cultural planning, municipal codes, cultural anthropology, and community eco-liberation psychology. From Oakland, California, we have James Rojas, who is a Latino urban planner, community activist, and artist, the founder of Place It. Rojas is also one of the few nationally recognized urban planners to examine US Latino cultural influences in urban design and sustainability. From Brownsville, Texas, we have Cristina Patino Howell, who lives along the US-Mexican border and is the director of strategy and co-founder for the arts collective Las Imaginistas. From Dallas, Texas, we have the Planning and Community Outreach Director for the Inclusive Communities Project, Jennifer Rangel. This is an affordable, fair housing nonprofit that advocates for neighborhood equity and fair housing options. Jennifer holds a Bachelor of Science in Recreation, Park, and Tourism Science from Texas A&M University and a Master's in City and Regional Planning from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Jennifer's upbringing in Oak Cliff, a Dallas, Texas neighborhood, shaped her passion for social justice, activism, and service. And she remains involved in the Oak Cliff as a co-founder with Moises y Molina High School, an alumni association which serves the school alumni and surrounding neighborhoods. From Denver, Colorado, we have the city clerk, the Denver city clerk, Paul Lopez, who is currently a former senior ranking member of the city council. Lopez's leadership spurred civic participation, ushering in the long overdue efforts to transform Denver's west side with its long ignored streets, sidewalks, bridges, and parks. From Seattle, Washington, we have Sam Afasa, And Sam Afasa is the director of Seattle's Executive Office of Planning and Community Development, an office responsible for developing and implementing planning policies and programs to support Seattle's current and future growth as envisioned in the city's comprehensive plan. He is also the city's lead planning agency that is charged with coordinating cross-developmental functions in order to comprehensively and systematically address growth, prioritize and direct investments, and assess how existing policies and practices encourage or discourage equity and future development. From Mexico City, Mexico, Krista Sacco, who is based out of Los Angeles, is a liberation psychologist, community researcher, theater artist, and educator who is passionate about community-led interventions that focus on disrupting the legacy of colonialism, white supremacy, and racism, and building communities of resilience, hope, and healing. In Los Angeles, she worked as an advocate for immigrant and Latino women around issues of gender violence, discrimination, and recovery. And she is currently working on a solar theater performance called Don't Tell Me Your Name, about women of color in the sex trade and sex industries. Looking towards the future, she joined a team, the company Demarc in Riverside, to build zero waste communities in California by repurposing 100% off waste into affordable and sustainable off-the-grid tiny housing communities that directly benefit from highly impacted communities and start to reverse the damage that has been done to the earth. From New York City, New York, we have the cultural anthropologist, Dr. SETHA M. Lowe, who is the former president of the American Anthropological Association, a professor in environmental psychology, and a director of the Public Space Research Group at the City University of New York. Lowe has served as a conservation guest scholar at the Getty Conservation Institute. In 2000, Lowe wrote in a book entitled On the Plaza, The Politics of Public Space and Culture, and has since written a book entitled Spatializing Culture, an anthropological theory of space and place. And that is all of our speakers. We're excited to have you here today. And as an opening question for our talk, just to get us centered in place, I see a lot of you have a screensaver that shares a plaza. And what we called this plaza talk as a metaphor because it's rare to have a village or town in Latin America without a plaza. And we chose the plaza as our central metaphor for this talk. And I would like to hear about your personal relationship to this space and what it means to you and your work in Latino urbanism before we set up the context with James Rojas. So if all of you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit about that, and we can start with you, James.
I'm raised in Los Angeles, and the plaza for me is my grandmother's side yard, because as a kid growing up, that was where the parties were. That's where the old man played cards. That's where we met every Sunday. And it's kind of like this plaza. It just kind of reminded me how people come together in spaces, informally, but they kind of pass down this whole plaza idea to the next generation in different forms. So that's what really became my idea about, why do I like the space was my grandmother's side yard as a plaza.
Excellent. SETHA, do you want to tell us about your work?
I grew up in another part of LA where there were no plazas in West LA, and there weren't a lot of gathering spaces. So when I went to Costa Rica for my fieldwork as a dissertation student in anthropology, one of the things that really captured my imagination was to go to the plaza every day. And I used to go, what's behind me is to Plaza Central. And there I would see all of Costa Rica, all kinds of people and children and doing all kinds of things and work and church and praying and playing. And I was fascinated, absolutely fascinated that a city could have this kind of dynamic space where everyone would come together and that represented the heart and I would say la cultura of the city. And then changed my work after that to go back and study Latin American plazas to see what we could learn about them to, in fact, bring to some of the cities in the United States that don't have these kinds of diverse and meaningful places.
Thank you. Paul, would you like to share?
Yeah, Well, I have an old school laptop. It doesn't allow me to put a background up. it's, I just discovered that. But okay, are you gonna bring that picture up? So, um, so that picture is actually me when I was a kid. I misunderstood Madeline when she said that send me one of your when you were a kid, something something that kind of talks about it. So, but I do have a story about this, right? And James knows this when he came to visit. No, definitely put that up. It is it's a space, right? It's a space. A long time ago, this was in 1985 when the earthquake happened in Mexico City, and I felt so bad because I was convinced as a kid that Superman would show up, because apparently after watching Superman a million times, he shows up and fixes the earthquake, right? He puts the earth on a rotational spin, and there was no earthquake. So I said, well, where's Superman, man? How come he's not in Mexico? And I got it in my head. Yeah, Mexican Superman. Next time there has to be Mexican Superman. And so that was me as a little kid being Mexican Superman. Here's the thing, it's about identity. These places are about identity. And I have a community that I was born and raised in that really, you saw it. You see the little fountains in the front yards. You see the wrought iron. You know when you're in the barrio, right, in our neighborhoods. But there was really no formal place for that. There was really no design in the space. And so what we did when I was a councilman, right now I serve as the county clerk for the city and county of Denver, overseeing our elections processes. But as a councilman, we went in and we said, okay, where can we make this space? How can we make this formal? How do we make this part of how do we make this a place, right? So we engaged in placemaking. We brought in, James Rojas when he was affiliated with the Urban Land Institute, to come out and really count all those grills in front yards, all those wrought iron yards, all those fountains, to really come out and start building places that reflected who we are, and that sense of Latino urbanism. And so right now, you go into the neighborhood in Westwood, and it's really a reflection of the neighborhood, right? And in some places, it's strong Vietnamese presence. So, it was created, the little Saigon district was born. And so right into the placemaking of it, from murals to hardscapes, to landscapes, things like that, all the way down into our part of the neighborhood where I grew up, where it was, the Mexican population is probably about 80-something%, right? You start seeing that influence, right? And we start using that in our designs and for the neighborhood to create that sense of place. So not necessarily a little placita, although we did actually accomplish that, and I just don't have the technological advancements here on my laptop to be able to show you. But it did shape the environment and the community, and then the persona of the community, so that they have a space that reflects who they are.
Okay, great. Thank you, Paul. And we hope to hear more. Sam, would you like to share?
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me. This is a great conversation. My background, I grew up in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, until age 16. And the two most influential public spaces for me are made up of two different sources. The traditional Ethiopian old Coptic churches that are carved out of single rock are always formed as objects in space. So you're always surrounded the church or the monastery, and those are the gathering spaces that I remember as a kid. But also the city is designed slightly sort of influenced by almost Italian plazas, and again, obelisks and structures, although Italians have been there only for 4 years. That space, my memory, was always around either a big gathering of political activity and or display of government functions. The monarchy, Haile Selassie, who was king of Ethiopia when I was the last king of Ethiopia for 3,000-year monarchy system. So that's what I grew up in. So you'd see a big ceremonial activities taking place in those spaces. But the influence on me from both of them were really the fascination around an object in space, and then the space that object sits in. And that was my earliest influence around wanting to be an architect initially, and then moving into city planning now.
Awesome. Thank you, Sam. We're going to move on to Krista.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to this conversation here. It's very timely of talking about places where we're allowed to gather. Let's see, I'm from a small town in New Jersey. So, I mean, you know, they don't have like a plaza per se. They have like their main drag. But there's also no diversity really there. There's no Latinos, there's no Black people. There's no like, yeah, it's just not diverse, not a lot of gathering space aside from bars. So yeah, I guess how that played into my work is my mom, and like my childhood memories go back to my mom. She would be like, we would host all kinds of things at my house. It was like the wiffle ball field in the backyard when we were into wiffle ball in the summer times. And you know, she would create the gathering when there wasn't a gathering in town, and she would invite all kinds of different people from all over the place, very interesting people. Or she would pile us into the car and like take us to that place where people are allowed to gather and like where it's okay and nobody's going to arrest you for curfew or whatever if you just want to like stand around and hang out in public with other people. But that's not actually a crime some places. So she made sure to like get us out and take us to those places. And now with my work, I'm mostly like a community mental health advocate. So I help create the gatherings, and that's it, whether it's like a digital plaza like this or somebody's backyard or a nonprofit or church rec room, whatever the plaza is whatever we make it. So yeah, that's a lot of my work is like drawing people in, engaging people, because you can't advocate for people to get services that they don't want or know about. So you have to draw them into a conversation. There has to be a gathering. That's why it's so important.
Thank you, Krista. Christina.
Hi, I'm so happy to join this fantastic group of people tonight. What I think about when I think about childhood memories and space and how my cultural influences have shaped me, I think a lot about matriarchs and my grandmother's influence. This is me with my mom, and that's my grandmother with my mom. And the role of my grandmother and my mother in shaping space and creating spaces of welcoming, primarily in the front yard, is what I think about when I think about my grandmother. Space where our family could gather and imagine and meet and share activities and also engage with our neighbors. And the story about Superman reminded me, I wasn't planning to share this story, but it reminded me of when I was a young person playing in my grandmother's yard and was influenced by Superwoman and would run out of the yard as Superwoman doing things in the city, until I realized, mostly from interactions with others, that there were probably some limitations of that embodiment that I needed to confront as I contained my practice as a young person. But that's a lot of what our practice looks like right now. We work with community members who are historically ignored in processes of shaping their geography, and collaborated with James and a number of other folks for a year-long process where the community came together in this border city to reimagine what the border could look like, to reimagine a decolonized border region that would reunite Brownsville with Matamoros, and also acknowledge its indigenous roots. And throughout that process, we engaged a number of different ways of knowing. So something that's really important for us is not having planning just be a verbal or intellectual process, but having it be a felt and spatial and aesthetic experience that people can express opinions with through a variety of different ways. And so one of the ways that the program, I'll bring it full circle to the Wonder Woman, what was in addition to kind of sculpting out, as you just saw, spatially what people wanted, we also had individuals embody what they wanted for the future of the city. So we did a number of site-specific performances where people rehearsed and practiced how they wanted to move through a future more liberated space that reflected their cultural values.
Wonderful. So you're still acting Wonder Woman, but with your art practice as the Imaginistas. That's
Yeah.
wonderful. Thank you. Jennifer Ramquez, do you want to go next?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you all for having me today. And I really owe my mother the experience of the Plaza, what that meant to me growing up. You know, we grew up without a car. And so when you're walking, you're more in tune with your surroundings, I would say. And when you're waiting for the bus stop, you're really looking at people's front yard and backyard. And so I immediately realized in the community I grew up in, how creative people were and how they really created that plaza-like experience that you're hearing from everyone this evening. And the other tie too was on her way to her job, I would go with my mother. She would work next to a bazaar, and that's something James talked about. And so it's really interesting that although it wasn't a plaza, like they call it a pulga, flea market, swap meet, whatever you want to call it, it was a place where people would go just to hang out and to find those products that they might not, see in those mainstream stores. And yeah, I truly owe it to my mother, and also got me to think not just about what I was seeing, but also to think about the reason behind, right? So why are people creating this? Is there something missing in their community? What are the underlying values of what they're creating? So it just really got me thinking about it in my neighborhood and in other parts of the country. And that led me to urban planning, just wanting to influence, the change in neighborhoods and help others along the way too.
Thank you, Jennifer. As we go further into how Latinos are reshaping the American landscape, James Rojas would like to begin and give us a contextual overview of how he has seen Latino communities' interactions in areas of public space, housing, transportation, and urban design that have shaped our communities. Many of the folks that are on the panel today, he has worked with. So James, are you ready?
Yes, I think I was thinking about putting this presentation together. I was thinking about the idea of a plaza. It's an actual place, it's an actual use, but it's also an actual state of mind. Yes, it's kind of it's a noun, it's a verb, it's an adjective. It's how we describe ourselves, it's kind of how we use space. And it's just this really interesting kind of phenomena that, that shapes Latino communities, and it's really kind of hard to it's kind of ubiquitous everywhere. This is so it has roots back to the Mesoamerican culture where they always had these gathering spots, so it has a really deep root within our community, and then what happens, when the Spanish comes, the Spanish kind of codify it in brick and mortar, not become the physical codified plan that kind of shapes, Latin American, communities. And it's really different than the way, the U.S. started its planning process with, the Pilgrims coming from England, and they were kind of an inclusive set of people in Massachusetts that really didn't want this kind of public space, for outsiders. It was all a very insider thing. And also, you had the people in Virginia, the Jeffersons and the Washingtons, that were just there for the money. They had slaves, they were making money, and it wasn't about building this kind of, communal spaces. So the Spanish, but so now these kind of like these Spanish forms, they're kind of transforming suburbia. Like these two trains of thought shaped U.S. planning, and now we're having from Latin America this other way of shaping the city. When the Spanish built these plazas, they were building them for the indigenous peoples and for the slaves, which could not speak Spanish, so they had to use this kind of really heavy visual spatial culture to understand place. So when you go to Latino neighborhoods, you always see these kind of places like this, shaping communities, murals, and a lot of visual spatial cues that help you define that you're in a Latino neighborhood. When you're in there, it's just really full of life. This is actually a plaza built in Barrio Logan. This is kind of built because the city built the freeway right through the community, and they pushed back by building a plaza, by building this kiosco there, this Aztec, Chicano utopian kiosco of a place, under the freeway. So again, it kind of shows you how this kind of spirit this sort of the plaza lives on. It really starts to kind of manifest itself in the 70s, with this kind of Chicano movement, and it becomes kind of this physical place. And you have places like this in Boyle Heights that are kioscos that are built later on in the Spanish style, and you have like this generation of old school and new school Chicano thinking, but again, it becomes this kind of physical space. And then you have this church plaza in East LA, just this kind of a place that, just kind of where people meet after mass, with the fountain and the murals, and kind of creating this kind of sheltered space. So it kind of shapes the, this is the Cesar Chavez Transit Plaza in San Fernando Valley. It's just kind of dedicated to Cesar Chavez. This is a a dead end street, in Boyle Heights. Now it's just kind of plaza that people use as a place, So there's all these different kind of ways this kind of plaza idea gets manifested through infrastructure. This is the other side of this wall is a freeway. So these two women take care of this plaza on this dead end street. Now it's kind of the sacred zone for that community. Again, it kind of pops up next. So it's kind of how people use infrastructure, how you use things in cultures never really died. This is a Pulga, swap meet, flea market, whatever you want to call it, an old factory in South LA that people have mariachis on weekends. They go and hang out here, and they find their community. This is why it's really important to have these kind of spaces. This is a front yard fountain, in the middle of a neighborhood, or somebody's trying to mimic a memory of a plaza, or just have the identity of an aspiration for a plaza. So it really takes shape in these front yards, different landscapes. Again, so how people use space is really kind of changes the way Latinos are, reconfiguring this American city, and how do we change zoning for that? This is a kiosco in Boyle Heights, and again, mariachi is waiting for work, and using that space, as a space for work. So so it has economic value. This is selling flowers during Mother's Day during the pandemic in Boyle Heights. You see people selling flowers there, but again, the streets kind of being this kind of active zone for activity. And kind of informal, it's just kind of popping up there, just trying to serve that need. This is a jogging path around a cemetery. Again, how people are using the space around a cemetery to jog as kind of social space and kind of recreational space. So it has different kinds. This is guys playing checkers in the bottle top. This is Mariachi Plaza, Pachuco Boogie, a dancing celebration in the plaza. It's all these different uses that are taking place there, and then you have recently protests there. It's a political space now. And you have formal spaces like this in Mexico. This is Guadalajara, a very formalized plaza. Then you have these kind of new spaces in Los Angeles that are kind of copying, these spaces. This is Plaza Lynwood in Plaza Mexico in Lynwood. Again, you see the kiosco, the shape of the plaza in Guadalajara transported over to Los Angeles or Lynwood as a plaza, and it's being used. It's a very active space. It's being used for people to go there. A lot of immigrants take their kids there because this is how they look at life in Mexico. And this is a Macho Plaza in Boyle Heights. Again, using transportation as a plaza. It's a transportation subway entrance being used as a plaza. This is in Woodburn, Oregon. This is where Latinos in Eastern Oregon kind of center around. It was a vacant lot until the city built a fountain there, made it into a plaza. Now they have the taste of Woodburn here, and all Latinos come and just kind of celebrate their culture. This is in the Riverside. An alleyway becomes transformed to a space. So again, it has all the different kind of manifestations where it can kind of happen at. It's not just kind of one size fits all. So the front yards. The front yards are becoming these kind of plaza spaces. This is what happens in the U.S. and suburbia. Suburbia, there is no plazas. People build them in their front yards. You'll see them across these lines. This is in East LA. The old house, the new porch to really kind of mimic the archways or arcades of plaza in Latin America. You'll see them, in the U.S. Latino, this is a front yard plaza in East LA. You have the planning, the light post. You'll see in Mexico in the front yard. But again, you're kind of thinking about that memory aspiration. How do you want to present this? Is a front yard fence in Denver. I took again. You can see the masonry work, the ironwork, a really elaborate, care and detail of what that space can look like. It's very kind of an aspirational piece of architecture. So the front yard becomes kind of plaza zone, but with the fence around it, versus in suburbs where you don't have fences around it. People use their front yards really creative ways. And these front yard fences become these points of social interaction between people, kind of hanging around. And it kind of builds social cohesion apart in the front yard. How many times have we seen a bouncy house in the front yard? Front yard for businesses. This is in Boyle Heights. So it's kind of all the different manifestations of what this is kind of shaping the landscape in the U.S. This is in Brownsville. The front yard there. It's all underneath this front yard. It's a place I kind of grew up in. This is another front yard, and where a fountain and trees. Again, you have the same kind of aspirations. You have this creative space. In these suburban front yards. You have shrines. Religious ceremonies. You have the dead altars in front yards. Again, another public, the nacimiento in the front yards. So it's a really common, thing. These front yards, the way Latinos are transforming spaces. We did a plan in Colton, and we had these front yard plazas as part of the design plan for the community because it was all Latino, and this is how they use their front yards. So might as well just codify it to a planning document and make it legal, make it normal, make it what you do. This is the work we did in Denver with Paul Lopez when we were there. But again, how do you make this road into a kind of gathering spot? People need kind of to really kind of uphold, the community's kind of social cohesion. Okay, this is it. Okay, thank you. I just want to give a context to what the plaza does. It means in the U.S. and how it's kind of reshaped in all these different ways to kind of have this discussion. But yet there's no land use going for it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, James. And one of the things that I really notice a lot about your slideshow was the fact that while those are a part of the built environment in places like Guadalajara, what people are really doing is recreating the environment in the ways that they can through their homes and through front yard spaces. And also, if they can, and it's odd, but you can see that it seems like a lot of the plazas that were built up in these places are kind of an afterthought. Instead of being central to a planning process, it actually seems like there's something that are kind of an afterthought. It's not as if the built environment is being created, and so people are mimicking it through their arts, through their murals, through all of these different ways. And I think part of the question, which is the next question, is how have you seen Latinos reshaping the built environment in your communities? And we can just begin and go through that for each of you because it's fascinating. We want our environments to be able to be representative of us. And how does that happen formally?
Yeah, I'd say growing up without knowing the language of Latino urbanism, without understanding zoning, it was pretty obvious to me that Latinos in my neighborhood were creating small scale pavilions, right? They would create the space to practice for quinceañeras, to come and host weddings and things of that nature, right? And the other big piece that was very personal that I noticed and really helped me out a lot was that they would also create garage apartment homes, granny flats, they have so many different names at this point. But really, when you want to talk about affordable housing, for us, informally, that was our way how we survived, right? We would hear, oh, so-and-so has a garage apartment, it's open, do you want to move in? Growing up, for my mother and I, that was our way how we were able to live in Oak Cliff based on her means, right? And so that wasn't, not to my understanding, I don't think it was allowed, but now the city, just for some background, the city of Dallas does have some measurements protocol in place to allow neighborhoods to have ADUs, accessory dwelling units. But again, growing up, you want to talk about learning what's on the ground and picking up some solutions. Latino urbanism, could tell you a lot of that, right?
Thank you. Christina?
Well, the first thing that came to mind is Latinos in Brownsville really using public space as a way to address the most pressing challenges that they experience. So along the border, economic development, or in Brownsville, we're one of the lowest income communities in the nation. And there are a lot of informal vendors in our community. They use public space as a place to continue cultural practices that are legal just on the other side of the border. So street vending, people vending fruit cups from their vans, people having triciclos, which aren't really sold in the US. You have to go to Matamoros and then like bicycle them across, that have this nice front carrier where you can put elote. And it's not really regulated in the US to sell that way, but we still see a lot of folks carrying over these cultural traditions very literally from the other side of the border to Brownsville. And then, as James pointed out, we had the good fortune of having James visit us in the region. You see folks taking control over what they, kind of exercising their control over the space they do have authorization for, which is their front yards. So we have yard sales happening constantly. And that's also an act of resistance because that's not regulated, and those folks do get ticketed. And so that's people really claiming public space and kind of asserting how they want public space to be used, how they want their private space to be used. And then also using that space to make up for what is lacked in public space. We have very few green spaces in Brownsville. A lot of the way that the valley was developed, most of the green space is right by the river, which is the border, and then a lot of that land has been seized for border wall construction, for DHS, for Homeland Security. And so what has happened is then, as James illustrated, has happened throughout the rest of the nation, these public, the front yard becomes these mini public spaces. It becomes a space where people can enact the green space that they lack as a community. And the last image that we just saw was one of the, based on these community events that we've had where people articulate what they want for the future of the community. A top thing that comes up is wanting more green space, wanting more spaces of gathering, wanting more infrastructure that responds to the natural environment, providing shade, because it is incredibly hot there. And you can see even when you go to Matamoros that there's much more infrastructure to help people walk outdoors in what is just a half mile across. So some of the visuals that we created are helping to make an articulation of what the community has expressed to create a shared vision for how to build that for that future.
Sam.
Yeah, so my experience, actually, I'm going to go back. I'm going to date James. So my first influence about thinking about the cultural aspects of public space was discussions with him in grad school, specifically about Latino urbanism and how so the dichotomy between the front yard and the backyard. White population, the backyard is important. So you do things in private. Latino populations and most people of color, it's that public space, the street, the front porch. So that stuck with me later on, as well as instead of how I experienced mostly Chicago, which has close to 30% of the population is Latino, and the Pilsen neighborhood, or even the waterfronts by the lake. The way the population uses the space in the public realm and in the streets is significantly different from others. It's incredibly vibrant. You don't have demarcation between the curb and the front porch and the street. So people weave in and out. And that's where you engage people and you get to know your neighbors a lot. And if you haven't been to the Pilsen neighborhood, I would highly encourage you, or even the Puerto Rican neighborhood. And it's always vibrant. It's always in the public realm. It's always on the streets. And then later on in my work, where very little population of Latino in places like Boulder, Colorado, or larger population in San Francisco, that was always important to consider in any policy work that I've been engaged in, especially in the public realm. Here in Seattle, the population is very small, just about 6.5%. That where that exists in places like further south, in the South Park, our engagement has always been how to reuse or multi-use of the front yard of the street or the public space. And that has actually become consistent with quite a lot of BIPOC or Black, Indigenous population and people of color as well. So in areas that we have the largest immigrant population in Seattle, where our actually primary focus is from an equity perspective to really address the public space needs, the street is one of the most important places. So we're looking at ways to actually dedicate those spaces either permanently from lessons from COVID and or temporarily. So we've been doing some pilot projects in those areas where you have vibrant mural paintings or street paintings with a lot of the Latino population and immigrant populations actually come together, and you have that intersection of a mosaic of multiple languages. And the second sort of most important thing in that engagement has always been food. So the food culture has been one of the most informative for our policy, to a point where we have a significant focus and funding for a food innovation district in the Rainier Beach area where most of our immigrant populations live, but also using food as a cultural element, but also an economic engine. So we're focusing significantly around that issues. But as we do that, we look at data and information, how we inform ourselves about the public place itself, the design or the requirement to be specific to the kinds of needs different populations have, all the way down to the furniture, the games, whether it's basketball or grill, that is really consistent with any kind of population, including Native Americans. So really understanding what their needs are has been a very important component for me and for the work that we do here, that should inform city policies as you not only invest, but also design and create the spaces to be more inclusive, but also responsive to the specific needs.
Thank you, Sam. SETHA, did you want to?
Yeah, I want to be, I guess first I want to talk about some of the problems that I see. I mean, as I said before, the early part of my work was on plazas in Latin America and trying to take what I had learned from that to the US and influence the design of public space indirectly and directly, but with this kind of, with a social justice focus. Here you have, this is the recent use of the Plaza in Chile, in Santiago. on the uprising, and trying to remember that plazas are symbolic spaces and politically important, as well as family spaces and a place of home, which is most what we've really been talking about. So the situations that I have mostly worked on or been involved in have been ones where people are losing their space, and where we've gotten involved with community groups to try to save the space, both for representational symbolic reasons and as a home place. So as I said, in New York City, it's been more in terms of Latino markets that begin to gentrify, or actually even being torn down, when they are in fact the heart of the community. This one being in Flatbush, Brooklyn, and Moore Street Market. We were, the legislature and everyone got involved in this political fight, which was a fight about representation and a fight about a political stance, and having what I call a translocal space in which a kind of pan-Latino groups could come together and politically work together. Creates a kind of much broader forum. So that's sort of a positive one, where multiple generations and Latinos from all parts of both the Caribbean and Latin America come together. But where I actually live in the summer is a town which is a half Latino and half very wealthy people, and at the east end of Long Island. And here, every time the spaces that you've been talking about, which I'm so thrilled to hear about, in which a space is taken and used, be it for volleyball or for a party or for a fiesta, whatever, that is closed down. Or where the beach that Latino families like to go together, or places where they tend to go fish, which tends to be in counter-distinction to white usage in the community, where you see police coming and moving them out. And I think Juan, you mentioned ticketing, but zoning and everything else. So I've been more involved, and I mean, it's not quite what you're asking me. Have I seen Latinos reshaping the built environment? Yes, over and over and over again. But what I'm more concerned about is the fact that they don't always succeed, and that planning and design in some parts of the United States, and even in some parts of Europe, I would say, do not support Latino urbanism, and have not really been receptive that there can be different kinds of spaces that are used differently, and that the cultural aspects of design really matter in a fundamental way, but also in a political way, in terms of having a sense of national belonging or state belonging or city belonging. That plazas, yes, have the home, I know that's where we started, but it has this broader, it's a broader political statement about belonging, being here, being visible, having power, and having power to shape the environment in ways you want. And at least in the at least in New York and Long Island, this is a constant struggle, which I don't know that we're yet winning. Maybe Corona Plaza in New York, in Queens, is the one new success that I really feel positive about. But I don't want to rain on our parade, but I also want to say there's a real struggle and a fight going on, and I want us to think about inequality, and I want us to think about social justice, and for me, the plaza is the representation of we can be here all together, and from a political point of view, that's so important. And so when they're torn apart, taken away, not allowed, ticketed, whatever, access denied, that's sort of the place I'm most interested in inserting myself and joining in hands with others to try to fight.
Thank you, SETHA. Yes.
Different.
Paul, did you want to weigh in here?
Yeah, I think it's I want to really highlight the part of the presentation where James was presenting, and really focusing on this notion of of Latino urbanism, and you know, and walking with James through the neighborhood, you know, on a little tour, he was counting grills in the front yards, right? And counting grills. I was like, he's helped me count the grills, and I'm counting the grills. And you know, here I am, you know, focused on the wrought iron, focused on the brick, you know, the little murals, that the rosas people put their in the neighborhood. They put all their most beautiful flowers in the front yard. I show them off. Usually rosas, you know, bathtubs that are half buried with a little bit of gencita inside as a shelter. There you go. You know, and we were counting. You know, those are the obvious things, but grills in front yards, right? And he says this is where community takes place. Absolutely takes place. And you know, me as a councilman at the time, that's how we really started understanding zoning. And part of it was, okay, well, how do we explain something as complex as land use and zoning to neighborhoods, right? And you know, typically you have you know, those kind of street sections like this. You have drawings, and they really don't create that sense of place without some kind of practice, right? And so what you want to be able to do, and what he did is we went into workshops in the neighborhoods, and he used Legos with the community, right, to help build what that would look like in as a whole. And so, you know, as a councilman, it wasn't necessarily just a plaza or two there, but the whole neighborhood. And retroactively looking at our zoning code and figuring out, where does this impede our placemaking? Where's the sterile, you know, city that Denver had become? And I say become because it used to have a Chinatown that was authentic downtown. It had, you know, different, I mean, 5 Points in the east side, which is, you know, African American historic Black community in Denver. Then the Latino community kind of spread around, never able to actually put down those roots of land use because of the fact that it was, you know, these were post World War II fabricated homes, and for the most part, zoning already was in place that did not allow signage that was a mural, right? And to date in Denver, to this day, it is still illegal to have a mural as your sign, as your official sign on your business. And so it's really challenging, you know, the system to be able to look at it through this lens, right? And so that's what we did, right? That's what we did. We went around and counted grills, right? And then murals. So one of the things, to answer your question, one of the things that really launched was this idea of muralism, right? How art shouldn't be confined to an easel, right? And it should be something that you don't have to pay a ticket to go into a museum and scope out, but it's a story of the community. And so that we were rich in. And, you know, at a time where people really frowned upon those things because they thought it was graffiti. They did not see the difference between a mural and just your few tags that are here and there, right? And so I think, you know, for us, it was really pushing that into the limelight, and it really caught on. We actually started working on that in our neighborhoods, put murals up where, you know, you had a lot of tagging, you had a lot of, you know, just chicken scratch everywhere. People started respecting it. People really saw themselves, the reflection of themselves in these murals, whether it was Cesar Chavez, or whether it was something that said, you know, Varios Unidos, whether it was the Virgen, right? People left those alone. And in leaving those alone, people really caught on around the city now to where every few days out of the year, we have these big art festivals where people come out from all over the world to come paint murals in Denver, including the gentleman that painted Obama's famous portrait, right? He has the Obey. Well, I can't think of the guy's name, but he has the Obey brand, right? He came out and did that too, and I think it really starts there. And so that's from counting grills in front yards to murals and pushing that forward. But Denver has multiple little areas that we're trying to really highlight and bring that organic culture out and remove those barriers. And I think as elected officials, as folks that are in government, whether you're planners and you're working internally, or you are an elected position or on a commission of some sort, you know, our job then becomes to allow to create they allow for the creation of these spaces, right? By removing barriers, so that people can use these as public spaces, right? Taking lead from what already exists in that neighborhood. And in some neighborhood, it's Latino urbanism. In some other areas, it's like Black culture, and really having that sense of vibrancy of community spaces in parks, in front yards, and street corners, and storefronts, and barbershops, and really kind of incorporating that into the design of the community. So, you know, it has to reflect that community. It has to be organic, has to be a mirror image, and good architecture usually incorporates that which is within, right? And that's what makes it so beautiful and exciting. I mean, the last thing you want to do is have Coca-Cola come out and paint your mural, because they're going to paint Coca-Cola, and those are the ones that get destroyed and they get tagged, right? The last thing you want is for, you know, Home Depot to come up here and say, hey, Plaza, right? We got it for you. No, out the window, those things won't last. Has to be organic. Not Taco Bell, has to be the taqueria.
And thank you so much, Paul, for sharing that, and also bringing up those barriers, which SETHA brought up barriers, and Paul, you're talking about it. And speaking of the barriers to transformation, actually, I know that both Jennifer and Christina have worked a lot in community engagement. So perhaps you guys can speak about how those barriers to transformation are being worked on by community, and as well as SETHA, I believe you also are working on that. So maybe you three can share a little bit about the community engagement aspect to overcoming these barriers to transformation in these communities.
Sure. And maybe I'll also start by folding in one of the questions from Jose through the chat, which is just how do we think about Latinidad, especially in relationship to the history of erasure of our indigenous roots and anti-Blackness within our community. And that was something that we began with as a foundational part of our project, Hacemos la Ciudad, was we started with a history of the region and a history of race and racism in relationship to space, and the history of using space as a tool to colonize and create division within our community that perpetuated anti-Blackness and also traumatized us in severing our roots from our indigeneity. So that was really a foundational discussion that informed how we began dreaming together. And then we also incorporated indigenous leaders as part of the discussions that we had throughout the project from the Carrizo Come Crudo tribe, but also recognizing that many of the participants had indigenous roots that they didn't have access to, that those roots had been intentionally severed as part of colonization through assimilation in order to survive in the region. So part of the reimagining had to do with finding memories and rebuilding those memories in public space, and imagining what that would look like from a mixed indigenous perspective, also recognizing that there wasn't going to be direct lineage connections, but people were kind of pulling from felt memories, from images from their own ancestors that maybe they didn't have concrete lineage ties to, but that were still culturally significant to them. And with respect to barriers, and then the other thing that I think it's just important to flag with that is that with colonization, we've also lost our connections to the earth. And so a lot of this was also about what does it look to reimagine our relationship to the earth. And so environmental justice was a big component of what a lot of our participants were thinking through. And it came very organically. It wasn't like we had to have a lecture from multiple different environmentalists who were experts in all these different things, people intuitively wanted to reconnect to the earth. People intuitively felt like there weren't enough opportunities to reuse materials in the region, that there weren't enough opportunities to relate to the land. So that was core throughout. And then in terms of obstacles, I mean, this is something that we see in the border, but also it's I think on the top of everyone's mind right now is how militarized our communities are, how militarized public spaces, how militarized it is for Latino communities and for immigrants, for Black bodies, and this is something where I think our work really intersects very closely with the Black Lives Matter movement, is as our immigrant brothers and sisters along the border are being put into detention facilities, and we're working to abolish these detention facilities. As these detention facilities very much are a part of our public space. These are spaces that we cannot go. These are spaces that are highly policed. These are spaces that take up a huge component of our community that are not for us. And also we have military agents. These are space parts. So I'll wrap it up there. I know I've gone on for a long time.
Oh, no, thank you.
Yeah.
Jennifer.
Yeah, so as in the intro, it was mentioned that ICP focuses on neighborhood equity work. And really our focus right now is looking at land use and zoning, right? Because they're similar, but still distinct. And so we are looking at doing that work with two groups in Dallas. First is the Southern Sector Rising, which is a coalition in Dallas, and they're focused on undoing the decades of racist zoning that we have in the city. And we're also working with Downwinders at Risk, which is a grassroots environmental advocacy group. And together, and you see some images on here of the Place It workshops we've hosted. Together, we're working on the Neighborhood Self-Defense Project, which is truly a grassroots approach. We're really focusing on Black and Brown neighborhoods that are surrounded by or have industrial zoning, because we come to realize quickly that some individuals live in industrial zoning. And so that leaves them very vulnerable to not just having bad neighbors, but all the bad things, contamination, pollution that affects people, right? Their health, their well-being, quality of life. So we're working closely with neighborhoods to undo that, right? So here we are challenging the zoning that they've been put upon in their neighborhood. And really the curriculum we developed, as we discussed, zoning is not a topic that you learn in school, right? And so we have to, as we engage with communities, we have to educate them along the way, right? We're not gonna come in and assume that you know everything we're talking about, right? We're breaking it down for you because we want you to then share that to your other neighbors, because we know that, you know, not everyone may show up at a meeting, but if you as a community member know how change happens and what needs to happen, you're gonna let others know when you're talking to them, right? When you see them outside your home. And so we provide that technical assistance, and our idea to impact change is by helping these neighborhoods create their own neighborhood-led plans, right? And so they're the ones saying, this is our vision, and then as a group, the coalition, we're helping them with, okay, this is a vision, let's look at your land uses that you want. What are the zoning codes that could make it happen? And unsurprisingly, it's like it's like putting a circle in like a square, you know, like entrance. I don't know if I'm explaining it right, but it's so difficult to sometimes really capture a community's vision because the zoning code hasn't been put in, you know, in mind of them, right? Some of those zoning codes are pretty old. And so here we are challenging them, challenging really the system that's been put in place on some of these neighborhoods. And again, for us, the vision, right, and something we keep hearing, you know, that's really the backbone of a neighborhood plan. And so we use the Place It methodology as a way to talk about planning, right? This is something that you create. This is your space. Let's talk about the values that you're, you know, that you want to see in your community. And so we're really following along. It's a pretty long process, right? And especially with COVID, that's made things a little bit more challenging. But if anything, COVID has reminded us that, it's really affecting a lot of Black and Brown communities. Like the numbers are pretty stark. And from what we see, you look at maps, there's great research that's been done in Dallas looking at air pollution, looking at bad industrial actors. And when you compare the redlining map, you compare the air pollution map, you compare the heavy industry zoning maps, there are census tracts that are overlap. And that is because it's all interconnected. And it's because zoning, it's a topic that we don't really talk about much in our community, but it's what's telling you what you can and you can't do. So for us, it's really important in this project to give people that language and to push back against that language, and they create their own language that hopefully could help them have the quality of life that they honestly deserve.
Thank you. What you recalled for me as well in discussing the zoning is that in the city of Santa Ana, where I live, you can actually see the spatial segregation that you're describing that actually was implemented. We have a lot of communities that came over to pick fruits at one point in history. And here's a map that has been put up of our city. And if you look, there's the Artesia Pilar neighborhood, which you can see the image. That's one of the areas where one of the barrios was. There's the Logan neighborhood, which is that tiny barrio on the right-hand side of the map. And there was a civic center neighborhood as well that got completely displaced. And then there's the Delhi community. The main thing about the placement of these folks and where they could live in this community has really to do with the fact that there was a sugar plant in Delhi, there was orange picking groves right next to Logan, and then in the Artesia Pilar neighborhood, there were other areas where people would work, and also the African American neighborhoods were over in those areas, and they weren't allowed to go into the top part of the map or into the bottom part of the map, which are wealthier still. And the central part of Santa Ana is where most of our population lives. And what's interesting is, like you said, those were industrial zones. So the zoning on all of the areas where the Latino families lived are all industrial areas that are next to train tracks, that are next to garbage dumps, that are next to areas that it's very interesting because a lot of the families in those areas may have been in our neighborhoods a long time, and they actually own their own homes, whereas a major portion of that central community is renter communities. So what would be the legacy communities in our cities are actually threatened, and there's a huge fight that's known in the Logan barrio where they actually changed the zoning code to make that a mixed zone so that there could be housing as well as the industrial mix in that neighborhood. And it just totally came to me when you were talking that when you look at that, those spatial divides still exist in space. And a lot of people don't really know that when they're thinking about communities, that these are actually places that people were pushed into living, and they haven't been able to move out of those spaces throughout the whole city, and those lines are still in them. So you just reminded me. But to go on, speaking of municipal codes, so we have folks from city government and planning here. So I would love to hear, starting with SETHA, and then we'll go to Sam and Paul.
Zoning codes in general, and much of planning has a long history, a very long history of racism, and banks and real estate and planning have been in cahoots for a very long time, and Los Angeles is a great example. We could go on and on and on about segregating the city and making sure that Latinos did not have access to adequate homes, funding. This is a major structural problem, that the entire structure of the landscape of the built environment helps to impede the kind of Latino urbanism that James is talking about. I mean, and I'm very sympathetic. I just wanted to say one other way that we in the public space research group interacts with communities in a different way, and that we often come in, say, to the Moore Street Market and work with a community to do to help them to do their own research on their own communities to be able to make more successfully fight claims to their space. That's one of the things. And most recently, we've developed something called a TESS, a toolkit for the ethnographic study of space. And what we're trying to do is take qualitative, subjective, embodied, Madeline, I mean, really heavily embodied kinds of relational methods and create a way for communities to go into their own neighborhoods and evaluate them in terms of social justice, and to evaluate them in terms of questions of distributional justice, of procedural justice, recognition, all the kinds of elements that we talk about when we talk about equitable spaces and social justice in public space, and help communities themselves to do their own analysis of their own community, and then use that as data or as a lever, as to go into government and push against those municipal codes, saying this is really what's going on in my community, and these are the ways that I want to change it. We want public spaces, but we want public spaces that serve us in the ways that are meaningful. So I also think
interestingly, for what you're saying, I know just in my own community, part of the exciting thing is that we're 3 and 4 generations in now. We have young people writing books about our community.
Right.
They are actually learning to be the urban planners of this future in which the numbers of people are actually changing across the whole United States. So, I mean, Latino urbanism is such an important topic right now. And just going to Sam and Paul, I would love to hear from the perspective of government, how is this transformation going? Is this something that you can talk about to the municipal codes and the ability to access and transform?
That's a great question, and I want to get to some of the comments that we're seeing pop up. A lot of them are dealing with something that we're dealing with here in Denver, and also what we're seeing in LA and what we're seeing in San Diego and a lot of these other areas is that they're becoming gentrified. And what I'm about to say, may offend some people, but that's just the story of my life, right? If we don't own it, then none of these things matter. If we don't own our community, if we don't have ownership of our business, then none of these changes in law matter, right? So I think so, and it's also a chicken and an egg question, right? It has to happen simultaneously. So this can't just exist in zoning, right? This can't just exist in land use laws or municipal laws or anything like that. There also has to be a sense of economic justice. So when we're thinking about, changes in government, one is actually making sure that government's eyes are open, especially when it comes to planning, so that they actually see what the community sees, and partly it's making sure that those leaders that are in your municipal government, your county government, your zoning boards, whatever, are reflective of the city, because they're going to make those calls based off of what they see in the community, and who better to do it than the community themselves. So we have to really make sure that, one, we have representation on all these boards, so those decisions are being made in a way that is organic. Two, we have to make sure that the community is educated. And I keep talking about the example of James and I working in Westwood and Denver, and even going so far as to bring out Legos to start teaching lessons on zoning, right? And making sure that they show up to these council meetings, they show up to these board and zoning adjustment meetings, so that they can actually advocate for these things in a way that makes them the subject matter experts, right? So they're not dismissed as some random community bunch that showed up in the council chambers. They have to have that. You have to be able to do that, and also because it's about sustainability, right? You want to teach a community and give them the tools in which to fight with, right? So yes, the need for us to be able to identify those barriers, like I said, they could be barriers as like highways that split neighborhoods. They could be barriers in terms of a lack of walkability and accessibility into these neighborhoods from one to the other. It could be barriers in zoning. Like I said, for example, murals not being seen as signs, like inappropriate signage for a business, right? That doesn't sound right. If you go back into the 1920s, 19th, there's all kinds of old murals that are being saved that are they're just old signs from way back in the country's heyday, right? So it's making sure that those are there, but it's not operating in a silo. So your planning department, your zoning departments, all that stuff, they have to work, and their mission has to match your economic development plan in the city, right? Because if you do not have those in sync, then it's all for nothing. Parks has to be on board. Everybody has to have that same vision in that neighborhood. The one thing that you can do to bring it all together, in Denver, we have neighborhood plans that are created, and they are adopted in municipal law and municipal code. Those become the law of the land. I mentioned this in the comments. As the councilman in the area that is 80% Latino, most of that population of that 80%, like high 90s, is Mexicano, Chicano, right? In the plan, the actual planners were very afraid of using the term Mexican, believe it or not. They were nervous about it. And I asked why. What makes the term Mexican so damn scary? Is it because you're watching CNN? Is it because you're watching Fox? Or is it just doesn't sound right with you? Because that's who we are, and you have to fight for that identity. They wanted to use Hispanic or Latino. Those are very generalized terms. We wanted to build something that really brought out who the community really was. And that, my friends, is in the plan. The word Mexicano, the word Mexican, is in the plan. That you have to fight for that. And little fights like that, but also big fights like allowing fountains in your front yard, or allowing a shorter setback as a frontage, allowing these non-conforming structures, which is our arches and our wrought iron in our front yard. That's what you have to fight for. But like I said, it has to be a multiple approach: economic, built environment, and socioeconomic and health, right? So.
Yeah, and you putting the emphasis on the fact that language matters, it's interesting because it reminded me, I know that Ruth Bader Ginsburg has come up in the media. There's a movie that was made, and how she put the word woman into all of those laws to make the rights of women come forward. And people don't understand that language is so powerful, because that is the law that's created, and the language has to be in there. So going to
think about it. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yes. No, go.
Think about when you go to New York and you go to Little Italy.
Yes.
There's no problem with that, right? There's no problem with Chinatown. No problem with Little Side. Why not really? And that's what we did, especially when we had the Southeast Asian neighborhood and Federal Boulevard. You have Cambodian, you have Chinese, you have Vietnamese. When we came up with placemaking and naming, right, and what would be the guiding document, we asked the community, what do you want this to be called? Instead of this Chicano kid that grew up, with you in the projects, what do you want it to be called? And guess what? Even the Koreans that own businesses there said, no, this is a Vietnamese community. Don't name it Koreatown. This is Little Saigon. And they all nodded their heads. And here's the planner again, Little Asia.
Yeah, I think it's really important to have that kind of right language, because, for example, in Los Angeles, we have the Metropolitan Transportation Agency, and probably 85% of the riders are Latino. That's who rides the bus. That's who uses it, right? But yet, they would never call it a Latino plan, so therefore we get nothing. We might get better bus service because we're fighting for it, but the overall system is used by Latinos. So why can't you just call it a Latino transportation plan? And then you can really start uplifting these stories and the system to really serve the community, to serve the users of it. I think people are just so afraid of, for a long time, I think before a lot of this Black Lives Matter stuff happened, people were afraid of that word. Because we can't say that word, it's all about being equal. We can't say, it's all just kind of, we're going to whitewash everything, so therefore nobody gets anything. it's really important to call these systems out now and say this is what it is. So we get a better product at the end of it. I think these whole ideas also with Christina and Jennifer. It's like, how do you articulate these values that people have? Nobody's going to go into a council meeting and say, I have a front yard fountain and it's great, but yet that's what they have. And so a lot of people, like I find, Latinos especially, they don't know how to articulate what that is. It's about a feeling. Sometimes words just aren't there to express it. So like, yeah, so what Jennifer was talking about, I use objects to get people to think about places with Legos and objects. Because for a lot of people, it's easier to build it and talk about it than actually say it. Yeah. So we really need to expand the way we communicate with people and how they can express these ideas, feelings of emotions that you really can't say. It's really not on a map. But yet that emotion or feeling is really integral in how you shape a community. And I think we need to start with that feeling in the beginning to get that feeling at the end of it. So many times we do products and plans, and they end up being half baked. But we got the zoning right. We built all the schools. They all unified, but they all feel like prisons. So really thinking about feeling and emotion being part of this plan and getting that into the whole discussion from the get-go. So people feel that that's going to be what they're going to get at the end of it. But yeah, but it's a really challenging task to get everything in order.
Sam, did you want to tell us about the zoning and municipal codes?
Sure. Sorry, I had technical problems and I lost the last conversation. I think to the points that were being made, especially Jennifer, in terms of living through past decisions, people like me and others in the planning and zoning, we're living through that. And that is actually has been the fundamental framework for our work here in all aspects of planning over the last 4 or 5 years. One of the reasons my office was created is how we address equity. So our starting point was data, a mapping, a heat map of displacement risks and lack of access to opportunity. And currently that is actually informing our public space policies. I don't know if you can see this map. Can you read the map? I'm not sure if I'm sharing it. So what you see on the left is kind of a heat map, actually from 1936, from the homeowners loan coalition or corporation. From 1936 map. So the green, let me see if I can enlarge it. The green is the most desirable. See if I can get full screen. And then it goes down to blue, light green, and then red. It gets worse as you go down, right? So that is 1936. A is best, D is worst. 2017, we did analysis of the city, and you could see who lives where. 85% of the white population lives in A. About 48% of people of color live in the areas of D, which you see kind of orange and light green. Average life expectancy, about 84.7 whites, about on average, it's 3-year difference. Actually, in the Duwamish area, further south, where the red is, we have life expectancy up to 13 years less. And those happen to be the areas that are most impacted by industry and pollution, as well as obviously poverty as well. So we use this map to actually target this and a number of other maps around displacement risk to target our policies, both investment and also planning policies. So this is a combined map, for example, public space equity mapping. Through this outside citywide program, we started about 2.5 years ago. We started quantifying and mapping areas less accessible or for any kind of public space, plazas, trees, to use as priority areas for investment. So the bluer, darker, greener area is where there's very low priority for us to build parks or public spaces. The lighter area that you can see on the south, that is where the need is. And it mimics the maps from 1920s, 1930s, 1940s. And what we started doing is, how do we use data to inform us and our decisions, but also to get resources from whether state or federal or other resources. What you see on the right, the map actually combines 4 data sources. Access to public spaces, from your residential work, how much access do you have? Race and social equity. There's a number of data input points that we feed into that map, what you see on the left. And then health outcomes, that is really relates to the places in the Duwamish Valley, the most polluted areas, life expectancy, and a number of other life data. And then growth and density, as we've been experiencing growth over the last few years, unprecedented growth. The most impacted people are in the areas that you see have less access and high risk of displacement. Those are the cheaper areas to buy land, so development pressures. And now after COVID, we're dealing with gentrification, disaster gentrification, because that is coming and we're trying to mitigate that. But from a public space perspective, we started focusing over the last year and a half in the South Park area to first listen to community groups who are impacted by health and lack of access to opportunity. And then how do we use public space beyond just plazas and outdoor spaces, but use it as a way for wealth creation, training, career pathways, job creation, leadership around bringing public spaces, ideas, bringing communities around a number of other issues, not just the public spaces outside. And so we started piloting that in the South Park area. What you see on this map along the Duwamish River, one of the most polluted area. We as a city, a state, are investing hundreds of millions of dollars to clean that area. What happens when you clean the area is property values go up. Then the same people that you're trying to help are getting displaced. So we're having a multi-departmental effort to actually mitigate the gentrification ahead of our investment in public spaces, so that they have home ownership or land ownership before the investments come to that place. So we have a focused area from that map, and then going out and listening to what communities want in those areas. And then we specifically worked with young, mostly Latino, indigenous people in that area. Start with them, because by the time this projects and ideas are implemented, those are the ones who are going to benefit from that, and they need to be owners of those spaces, and then getting them to express their ideas and their cultural or other ideas, and have that at the table working with them, and then use that for generating resources from multiple places, but also the city dedicating public spaces or parks, try out pilots on the streets, closed streets, and then let them express how they want those places built over time. And based on some of those experiences now, during COVID actually, we use this map and data in areas where we need to close streets, especially where people of color and restaurants and a lot of immigrant communities live, because they need those spaces during home closure and stay-at-home order. So that became kind of a roadmap now for a number of other, food innovation districts or the Ethiopian community in Central District, so that they can go out on the street, a closed street. Now we're going to make about 20 miles of that permanent as part of this experience. But it's also a place of lessons in teaching others. We have a lot of Muslim communities and different kinds of communities. That public space should be where we have those kinds of conversations, just about it beyond just having the space, but this political discourse, economic opportunities. But again, it goes back to sort of being informed with data, and then listening to communities to address that. So those are the kinds of focus. And part of that is really changing the zoning. So now we're updating our comprehensive plan, which we do every 5-7 years. The starting point of that is a thorough analysis of the impact of the last 25 years decision around our land use planning policies. So from that, we're going to help inform major changes within the comprehensive plan that very much focus on race and social justice issues around land use policies and zoning decisions. So get out of here.
Wow.
So that's kind of the focus, that as the starting point, really undoing the past ills from planning policies and zoning is front and center now. And then the Black Lives Matter on those
Sam,
policies.
it seems that your sound is breaking up a little bit. I'm not really sure why.
Yeah, I'm having some technological problems. I'm sorry.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for sharing, and that's amazing. It's amazing to see the whole plan and how you've been working. I hope that, I mean, I'm sure that it takes the influence of folks in that city planning seat to have that forward thinking, as well as Paul had mentioned, the representatives in office who are our staff and our council members, et cetera, are very important to actually being able to capture what the desire is, and then the community engagement part is extremely important as well. I wanted to ask, because I know we've been talking a lot about some of the things that we need, but I know also something that brings a lot of courage is the amazing work that is being done and that you have seen in the transformations that you've actually witnessed in your own areas of work. And I know some of those have been touched on, and I know like James Rojas is doing a very robust process of working with planning departments and others to actually bring this organizational structure of place it so that people can actually talk about their communities. But I'd love to go back through and hear from you. What are some of the transformations that you've seen happen in working with your communities, and what are some of the wins that you have had in the struggle that many of us have dealt with in working in those cities? So
I'd say for the neighborhood self-defense project, it's ever evolving as we speak. But we are, there's a process some cities undertake to look at the zoning on the ground. In Dallas, it's called the authorized hearing process. And so there's a neighborhood we're working really closely with who has a lot of heavy industries, has a huge shingle mountain that shouldn't be there next door to people. And last year, they, again, part of the full effort of the Southern Sector Rising, Down When You're at Risk, ICP, and others in the community really pushed and tried to push the political needle to get this authorized hearing that whenever they're next in line, the city will look at the entire section of their neighborhood to rewrite it. But for us, we're not going to wait. And that's why we're starting the work already, because we want them to have their neighborhood-led plan in place. So whenever it's their turn, it's like, well, here it is. We've done the work, right? And so for all the neighborhood plans, I think Paul mentioned it too, it's so important for the plans to be recognized and adopted into the city. So the city of Dallas is about to start updating their comprehensive plan sometime later this year. And we're gearing up, right? We're gearing up to helping these neighborhoods to be ready, right? Ready when the comprehensive plan starts getting updated, to have all the ducks in line. So I would say it's ever evolving, but that huge authorized hearing for the area of that neighborhood with heavy industries, that was a huge win for them. That's like the door opening, and we're running right through that door as we speak.
nice.
Well, one of the things that came out of our planning process was not exactly a planning win, but I think it will lead to other future planning wins. I think, as I mentioned earlier, we asked activists to imagine a day in the more future equitable, liberated version of our community, and then to write a script about it, or we helped them to write a script about it, and then they performed it in public space. And so one of the performances that resulted from that was a queer activist cast a number of drag queens in a sketch about door knocking to create an LGBTQ advisory task force to the city. And after that performance, they felt like they had the information that they needed to bring that into a reality. So then they took that information, they went to the city council, they then got enough city council support to put it on the ballot. Then the initiative was passed, and now we have an LGBTQ task force. And a lot of that has to do with access to public space. We have a number of transgender people who have disappeared in our community. And so the visibility of transgender individuals is very much an issue of how we embody ourselves in public space. And I bring that story up because I think it was really about the persistence of the people that were involved with the project to take the ideas forward, as opposed to us presenting a new idea and then the city saying, oh, great, we love it, and then stamping it and then moving it forward. It required an individual to organize and then take the ideas from the art project and then consistently kind of follow through to gain momentum to bring some of that into a reality.
Excellent. And
Yeah, I think it's important for people to have a vision of the future, because that vision will take the power. If you don't have that vision, you'll never have the power. So for me, it's getting people the idea to have that vision, and it might come out tomorrow, it might come out in 2 years, 5 years, or 10 years. But at least it's in their head now, and now they can germinate there, and they can see when they can apply it. So it's just kind of putting that seed in their head to kind of move forward. And it's all about kind of making planning about their life, not our lives.
excellent. And Sam, these are really our wrap up. So what can you just, Sam and SETHA, share some of the wins that you've seen, and Paul as well, as we wrap up the talk? Sam.
Some of the wins for us, and especially in the last 3-4 years, is really sort of building community and empowering community. What I didn't talk about is, in some cases, through the Equitable Development Initiative program that we have, which public spaces are an important component as well. The communities that are impacted from those areas are actually at the decision-making table as well. We have huge challenges, huge problems. Growth has been on steroids and in this city just before COVID. While the economy is going to be very, very challenging over the next few years, the need for affordable housing, the need for public spaces, the need for addressing BIPOC communities in terms of the impact from this economic crisis is going to be huge. And they have already, and we've heard a lot over the last few years in engagement, and they will be at the decision-making table as well as we start thinking about recovery moving forward. So there's some good DNA and muscle memory as well from I can name almost like 60 organizations that we're working with now. There's a community-based initiated ideas and programs that they have proposed over the last 3-4 years, including significant amount of public spaces and equity issues. So I think some of the wins are, I think there is a momentum, and there's, as hard as difficult time that we're having now, this is also an opportunity where great transformation can take place, not only about the stuff that we do, but how we do it, breaking down our own internal racism, institutional racism. So we're asking that as an organization, as a city, to really dig deep in really understanding our own racial barriers and how that plays out into the decisions that we make. So the wins are really that sort of the being woke because of the current racial crisis.
Thank you.
I think the biggest wins, I mean, you're asking in New York, is probably saving the markets that we have been able to save, and the monies that now has gone to renovating parks in all kinds of poor and marginalized community. But for me, the bigger win is really at a global level, which has been the level at which we've been able to influence the new citywide public space assessment tools being put out by the UN, by public space, and with its cultural relevance and importance being part of the new urban agenda, and with the global-wide training programs and facilitations of the kinds of ideas that we're talking here being disseminated to communities all over the world. At the World Urban Forum in Abu Dhabi back in February, hard to believe we were anywhere in February, people, planners and activists from all over the world are coming together, trying to find ways to work with public space, and maybe they're not all plazas, but public space is a center for democratic practice and equitable social places that should exist everywhere, everywhere from refugee camps all the way through to the kinds of Latino communities that you're talking about here. And I think Sam is right. I think this is going to continue, and I think there's been a change and there's a shift. And as long as we all keep pushing in the different ways, be it research or activism or policy or legislation or whatever, that I think together we will have a better future.
Thank you. And Paul, some of the women. I think you're on mute. Mute right now. Yes.
Okay. I mean, I think some of the wins, some of the takeaways is that, I mean, I just, in listening to all the different takes and just input and examples, in order for this to be lasting, it can't just live, and this philosophy can't just live with the folks that are within the city, that change jobs, that make career changes. This has to be muscle memory that's learned in the community. Mm-hmm. It has to be, I mean, the community has to become subject matter experts in this field. They have to be able to be equipped with the right tools and trained to be fearless and to be confident in the same room as high-paid developers. They, oftentimes when you have economic interests battling over zoning decisions or community plans, or community development organizations that don't necessarily have the community's interest at heart, you want to make sure that the community can easily combat that, right? That they can present the other side of the argument for the sake of preservation in their communities, but also for this philosophy, right? It's a great philosophy. It's something that I know helped shape me and helped kind of opened up another lens in terms of zoning and land use and placemaking, and to see it a planner as part of the Land Institute, right, nationally, that kind of looked like me, right? That had the same philosophy as I did, that understood what those grills meant in people's front yards. To see a planner on that level, automatically trust was elevated, right? Mm-hmm. Automatically, it was just, it was empowerment just to be seen, right? And I know sometimes in our community, we're obsessed with being the first to do things, but that's already old. That's getting so old. Our story, and I don't want to break hearts, but none of our stories is unique. There are millions of our stories out there, and it's time to not be the last, right?
Well, one of the things that I heard from all of you was amazing. Thank you so much for being here today, and this is such an important conversation. The fact that we are in a time of COVID, and there is this kind of moving away from this kind of looking at this growth model that we have and being able to kind of hold back and start to figure out what we want, there is this great opportunity, which is that maybe within this period of time, there is the ability for us to do the kind of transformations that our country needs specifically. And I think that that's being called to task right now very much. And maybe the slowdown is important to that advance. And I hope that all of you have shared that there's different kinds of methodologies in use. It sounded like, Christina, you brought up something that sounded like pedagogy of the oppressed, or the theater of the oppressed, where people actually went out and transformed after doing it through theater. And I would love it, as Placemaking US continues to build its tools, it would be wonderful to get copies from each of you of your tools to put in the toolbox, so that other folks that have been on today and maybe want to utilize Place It, or some of the art practices, or some of the work too, Sam, that you're sharing. I know that one of the things that helps is when you set precedent in doing something in one community, it helps us to be able to use those documents and set precedent in another community. So any of you who have information or guidelines to put in the toolbox, please feel free to share that. And we're so excited to have you here today. Thank you so much. And you'll be able to share this with your communities beyond today. So we thank you for being here.